when the flood of fear, which by the way, anticipatory anxiety, adrenaline is normal. When you're in a high pressure situation, say you're going to give a big presentation or a speech or you're going to ask for something big, you're a salesperson and you're closing the deal. It's normal to feel a flood of anxiety, but you've got to normalize it enough to know that you're going to metabolize that. You're going to show up. You do have the chops, and you just got to see it through.
You've developed a self-awareness of who you are and where you want to go. But now what? Sound familiar? In my 20 years of practice as a Superior Court Mediator, clinician, executive coach, and parent, I've noticed one thing above all. No meaningful transformation can happen unless you find and apply the tools and skills that are right for you. See, the thing is, without tools, without a recipe, you might as well flip a coin and hope it works. Or you get burnt out listening to bad advice and following tips that just aren't useful in your situation. I have been there, and I've seen thousands of clients right there as well. My name is Deepa, and Recipes for Life is my show where you and I learn the ingredients of high-performing, well-adjusted humans, how they get through their own life, all to craft a recipe for life of our own. Today's guest is Dr. Jenn Kennedy. Jenn started as a publicist, then worked as a freelance journalist for over a decade. Both of these careers were about her love of people, and that passion was so visible during our conversation today. Her burning desire to understand what made people expand and retract, struggle or thrive is apparent, which is why it's no surprise to me that now Jenn has earned a PhD in clinical sexology and works as a sexologist in addition to individual clients, couples therapy, and intensives. She also runs a small group focused on sexual health for women and has her own podcast on the topic of sexual health through the Pleasure Project. By the end of today's conversation, you'll learn about the differences between what a coach, what a therapist are qualified to do, and when you might need to hire one and not the other. You'll deep dive with us into exploring the tools that can help create harmonious relationships and how to deal with fears of failure and unhealthy codependency. Jenn teaches us about intra-psychic blind spots and how insecurities show up in the most curious ways when you least expect it. Finally, one of the things that I enjoyed most about the episode is how radically humanizing Jenn makes all of this. She walks us through so many examples of how high-performing people at the top deal with all the same stuff as anyone, and how they in particular can be out of balance, where their professional lives excel, but at home they're distracted and unavailable to their partners and family. My favorite part, she shares that there is always hope to fix it and includes a few examples of the tools and tactics that she's used with clients to make it happen. Before we jump into the show, I have one ask. Teach what you've learned to someone you care about within 48 hours. Here's the amazing and insightful psychologist, Dr. Jenn Kennedy. All right, Jenn, so kind of tell me, what is like the one ritual that you will not miss on any given day, or do you have a ritual?
What is my ritual? I don't have a daily ritual. I have several sprinkled throughout the week. Like, for example, every Monday I do yoga. I protect that time. I do yoga and I have breakfast after with some close girlfriends. Another day of the week, Thursdays, I walk with a friend. Most days I'm having tea. So I would say those are kind of the most consistent things of how my day begins. Yeah.
And what happens when you don't do one of your rituals?
It makes the whole day sometimes feel kind of disorienting or a little bit off. I like easing into my morning. I build in a couple hours actually before I start doing clinical work to do self-care, to do some exercise, typically to run errands, that type of thing. And if for some reason I'm folding up and out, I just don't feel as settled, and I like that ritual. So yeah, it's challenging when I don't get to do it.
Right. So as you said, to your point, you definitely protect that time on Mondays and Thursdays. And consistently, one of the things that you do is have tea. Any kind of specific tea that you have?
I love rooibos is my favorite. I have this.
I'm sorry, what is it?
Rooibos?
Can you spell that?
Rooibos.
Oh, wow. Is that a brand?
Roibos. No, it's a type of tea that is delicious. It's loose leaf. It's sort of a cousin to like chai, maybe. Yeah, rooibos. It's really good. Oh, what is that brand? I can't remember the name of it right now. I can see the packaging. I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, sounds good. So Jenn, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell us a little bit about your work. What do you do?
Sure. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also a clinical sexologist. So I wear kind of multiple hats within those. I work clinically with people in talk therapy, and that includes folks coming in for support around their sex life. That could be couples or individuals. That also includes sexual compulsivity. So folks that are struggling with some compulsive behavior around sexuality. And then just a smattering of other people who want support. That's sort of my clinical side of things. And then I've also got more my coaching side of things.
Tell us a little bit about your coaching side of things.
Sure. So that side of the business is I've been teaching for many years, typically human sexuality and intimate partnerships, which is sort of the couples class in graduate school. So I took material from there. I also took material from my dissertation, which was all about sex therapy with lesbian clients, and built a curriculum. And I run that every 6 weeks. Sorry, not every 6 weeks. I run that for 6 weeks, a few times a year. And that has historically been for women. And in addition to, that's an online program where people come in who really are very focused and knowing they want to help kind of have their sex life be different. So that also includes a podcast that's all about that, called The Pleasure Project with Dr. Jenn Kennedy. So I have that going, as well as I write original articles that are in service of that whole effort too.
Excellent. And you're saying part of that work is more connected to your coaching work, and that's how you differentiate both your coaching and your clinical practice.
Yeah, the structure is different. You know, when I'm doing a one-to-one, more typically for like a clinical type situation, the client is scheduled, they're coming in, or we're online, and we're looking at, you know, goal setting, and we're doing clinical work that is typically related more to a diagnosis or a dysfunction. Within the coaching realm, it's different because I've got a curriculum that is planned, and it's a group environment. I'm taking them through exercises. You know, we're not getting into any deep psychological dysfunction. That's not what this is for. It's a very different packet of work. It's more like they're coming to a program that's going to be really tailored for their specific thing, but it's not a one-on-one. It's a group pre-planned curriculum. So it looks different. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that totally makes sense. So let's just kind of dive into it. I have like a really big question for you. I mean, in your work, one of the most common things, what is one of the most common things that high-performing clients deal with? What would you say it is?
Yeah, most of my clients are pretty high-performing, and the work-life balance is a really big issue. Like I'm seeing them more on the clinical side, oftentimes with their partner. And the partnership is out of balance, and there's dissatisfaction, there's disconnection that's happened over time. And oftentimes that is because they've prioritized work, and they're really doing well in work and they're excelling, but they're exhausted, they're distracted, they're anxious, they might be a little bit irritable and unavailable for their partnership. So that's oftentimes where I see them on the clinical presentation.
Okay. Are there any other areas that you see your high-performing clients, or is it just clinically that you see them?
I mean, sometimes some of those women have come through my coaching program. And that's, again, because their life is out of balance and they feel disconnected from their body, from their sexuality, from their sensual energy. Then they might also be a good candidate for the program. But that's very different work than the one-on-one. And I think it's really powerful. Also, this is a big differentiator because of the group aspect. and hearing other women, echo some of their experiences and recognize that they also have a full life that they're trying to balance. And so it's not as simple as like, just do this, right? It's a dropping into the self. It's maybe being pushed in ways that you wouldn't do for yourself. I mean, that's the beauty of coaching.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're talking, the thing that comes to my mind is it also feels like when you can relate to other women or other people, and when you can all have like sort of some level of shared perspective, it makes you feel like you're not alone in this, like you're not the only one struggling and dealing with this.
I think that is such a magical part of why the group dynamic can be really, really effective and transformational. I know a lot of, especially like successful people, don't want to put themselves in front of others when they're not at their best, when they feel vulnerable or they feel like they might have some deficiencies. And this definitely comes up in the sexual realm too, right? They don't want to necessarily name that. And yet it is so powerful when they do, because it is normalized, right? What some of the stuff that they're struggling with is named. They get to hear how other people face the challenges and get support. They just feel less dysfunctional when they can get it out and nobody, judges them for it. So I think it's pretty incredible how, and we know this from corporate training. We know this from that's why corporate folks do those retreats where they all do trust building and stuff, because when you have that in place, it just feels different.
Right. There's a level of psychological safety, and there's like an ongoing trust building process that allows us to be very vulnerable and share our like deepest fears, right? And then that way it'll also allow us to sort of work through them. That's great. I wanted to sort of ask you, when most of your clients come in, what level of awareness do they have into what's going on with them? Or do they just come in like something's not right?
Yeah. It's interesting, especially because I'm thinking about, we share kind of similar populations. And so most of the folks that I'm working with are quite successful. And so they have awareness to some degree about what their strengths are. They've probably done some of those strength builder type, assessments and such. But they seem to have a bit of a blind spot around things that are more in the category of mental health. They can feel that there's things that are holding them back, but they don't know the why, or because they're usually quite disciplined and quite intelligent and quite, that's part of the correlatives with success. And yet there's this, I would say, this blind spot around maybe interpersonal or intra-psychic understanding.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the intra-psychic blind spots? Like, what does that look like, or what are some of the behaviors that you see in that?
Yeah, I think, again, with this population in particular, sometimes they can present with a little bit of like what we would call some narcissistic traits or some grandiosity. And I think that to be super successful, you kind of have to have that, in some realms. But the flip side of that is the insecurity and the fear of like failure and the desire for approval. But there's also, they have to take a certain amount of risk to get where they are, right? They can't just be the safe, steady, because you don't become typically in a C-suite if you're not willing to do some risk taking. And so with risk taking comes anxiety, comes fear, comes self-doubt, comes, some of that, like, is this all going to come down like a house of cards at some point?
Right. Is that almost like a low level thing that they experience and they don't realize that they're experiencing it? Because these are like individuals, as you and I just spoke about, like they're really good at what they do. That's why they're so successful in some cases, right? But there's this like, as you're talking about this low level of anxiety or this little bit of self-doubt, little bit of fear of failure. It doesn't overpower what they do, but it's there somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's typically under the surface a little bit, but it's there. And it's interesting because I think as they progress up and up and up, there's less interaction there's less negotiation. We were talking about this offline a little bit. And so oftentimes really amazing leaders are connected to their population. They are connected to those that report to them, as well as like the whole company. Like they have a beat on it. They have a sense of the corporate culture, and they participate in that. They don't stand above and separate. And yet I think that it does get increasingly harder because you can't laterally, you have fewer lateral people to interact with, to bounce ideas off of, to complain to share your own struggles or fears or et cetera with. And so, as it goes up.
As it goes up, to your point, there's like, they don't find themselves in situations where they constantly need to negotiate as opposed to managers. And what does that do for them? Like, how does that sort of not help them be those connected leaders that you mentioned earlier?
I think they tend to be, especially at that C-suite level, they tend to be idea people. So there's lots of great ideas. There's some visioning, but I think sometimes they lose touch with and understanding sort of what matters to everybody else. I was just listening to a lecture this last week at a conference, and this study came out, and it was fascinating, from this professor at Berkeley, and she was saying that that much of what leads to burnout is not necessarily like, those people don't necessarily just need more money. They really want to be recognized. They really want to be appreciated. And I think a lot of companies miss that. And as you get higher and higher, there's so much responsibility to make the numbers work, to make, to watch all the components of the organization, but sometimes forgetting about the connection to the people and them feeling good in their job, interested in their job, rewarded and acknowledged.
Yeah. Rewarded, acknowledged, and, as we know, validated for, what they're doing, right? Because as you yourself said, they have very few people that they can actually connect and talk to and share some of possibly their fears or their, stuff that they're dealing with, because they have to show a persona of just being like really tough and being those people who know everything and can do everything right. And I think at some level, that definitely is not a way to be at a job and still be connected.
Well, and the other piece is, I typically see them in my office with their spouse, who has oftentimes been a supporting role, and yet they're quite frustrated because they feel like, okay, you don't get to be the CEO of home, right? At home, I'm the boss, or we're the boss. And so that rebalancing of shifting gears and coming into their personal life and having, having a different role play out, and where they have to negotiate and sort of be more empathetic and more democratic is different.
Yeah. So I would love to hear, like, confidentially, of course, without naming names, either like a success story or a story specifically where you kind of helped either a couple or a high-performing client, and also the tools of how you help them.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about a guy who is an executive. He didn't come in with his partner. He came in alone. And he's super smart, so engaged. I mean, I will say that I love working with these folks because they have so many of the tools to change, and they have access and willingness. Typically, they come for support because they want to seek out a professional, and then they engage the professional. And it's like, yay, okay, they're ready. They know how to do this. And this guy in particular, he was anxious. He was having, there was some infidelity in his partnership, and he was having a lot of feelings about it. But right off the bat, I suggested to him that he try Headspace, which is an app that I love. And it's really a great, very approachable way to start doing some mindfulness. And he told me last week that I think he had done like 270 days straight. Like, basically, once he started, he's done it every day. And I was like, nobody does that. Nobody does that, right? And he has gotten so much calming from that. He's gotten so much centering from that. We also did some intake of kind of his history, his family of origin. And I recognized that he was an adult child of an alcoholic. That matters because that comes with character traits. And so typically some of the parts of that that setup make us great leaders, because they tend to be hyper responsible and dependable. They're very independent. they're very vigilant. They're paying attention to everything all the time because those are all skills that had to be developed in their family of origin to keep them safe. And they had to do a lot of like taking care of themselves because unfortunately their caregivers were not. So flash forward, here he is very successful. And yet there's also drawbacks to some of that, right? It's asking for help is quite difficult. Identifying your own needs is quite difficult. Having balance is not so familiar. Knowing your limits, that type of thing. So I directed him towards ACA meetings, Adult Children of Alcoholics meetings. And that has been really, really helpful for him. Again, just getting other people sort of echoing what's happening for him. He is also a voracious reader, as are many of these folks, because again, they're smart. They want to know what, and so I have just fed him. I started initially feeding him books that were exactly kind of like, like some Brene Brown and, like about being more vulnerable. But then he started just kind of wanting wider and wider. So looking at, happiness, looking at meaning building, looking at not so much leadership, like he's got that down, but it was just, he approaches it as a whole person. I approach it as a whole person. He was totally on board for that and just has really been a fun client to work with. We also, one of the big interventions I used with him is to connect. He doesn't have friends. I find that a lot of these, especially men that are successful, don't really have friends. They, once they get out of graduate school or college, they don't facilitate those friendships. And if they have a spouse, sometimes that spouse will do it, but they themselves are just sort of like really ambitious. And so they don't have a lot of friends where they can just hang out and go do things and reflect and, not have to perform and not have to manage, but just be friends with. So I've nudged him. I actually even made an introduction to him and another client of mine, and they've become friends. They meet once a week and have coffee on Fridays. And that's been a really nice way for him to, sort of have someone else to talk to that he respects and that is a peer. Yeah.
Wow, that's
cool,
okay.
Cool case.
No, that's wow. So here's what I'm thinking, right? As you're sharing all of these things, the thing that comes to my mind is this client was really wanting to come and not only seek help, because a lot of the clients come to us to seek help, but it's actually people that follow through and are consistent with doing the things that they talk about, whether in therapy or coaching. That I feel is like the most defining thing about a successful coaching or therapeutic client, right? Because that's what I heard you say. Like he just absorbed everything that he were talking.
He literally takes notes. He's had this notebook. He brings it home with him. He sometimes will read me journal entries. That was a new thing he started too, was journaling. He'd come back and do reflections of what his perception of his interpersonal dynamics with his wife were, just thoughts he had, when he had some insomnia and woke up, I had him write. And then, that like would release his brain a bit to go back to sleep. But yes, he absorbed everything. He took direction really well and implemented it. And that makes such a difference because we only get to see them for 1 or 2 hours a week at most. You got all those other hours that you've got to deepen and reinforce the new behavior, the new tool to have it really land and become part of you.
Yeah, I mean, and the things that you've done with him is like, in collaboration almost, is Headspace, like going sort of deeper into family of origin, is helping him sort of look at ACA meetings and see if there's value in there for him to participate, and to also kind of understand the strength in creating friendships or connections that are outside of work that'll just help him just be more himself, right? And these are all the things.
These are nuances. I mean, he's again a high functioning person, but looking at his codependency, looking at maybe some of his loneliness, those are things he didn't come in naming, but were pretty apparent. And so these are interventions that I'm naming, but also just a lot of us talking quite openly about this, because I do think a lot of people at the top feel kind of lonely.
I think you're absolutely right. But I think part of that is, and we're not saying this is going to help every person. We're saying it's unique to, people and situations, right? But to this person, to this client who was highly engaged and motivated to work on themselves, these are the things that really helped him, sort of like just move through and address and manage some of the things that he's been dealing with. And also, is there a, because, in coaching, there's a level of accountability that we do, like when we check in every week, or when I'm coaching clients once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, like we have baby steps, we have accountability. How do you work with accountability? With this client, clearly he's doing it all right, but in general.
Yeah. Homework is kind of an interesting thing on the therapy side of the world, because for the highly motivated client that comes in and says, I want to get better as quickly as possible, then I'll say, great, here's homework you can do in between. Go do it. For the person that's sort of a little more ambivalent, if I give them the homework, they're likely to not do it. And then they feel bad about it, or they feel it's a reminder of them kind of failing. And so it creates, sometimes I find some tension. So I'm happy to give homework if someone wants it and if someone does it. But if they don't do it, I'm not going to keep giving it, because I don't want to set them up. And what over and over they've shown is that the most important element of change in the therapeutic space is the rapport between the clinician and the person. So it doesn't really matter what your particular, theory is. It matters how that person feels about you and how things transpire between you relationally. And so if I know that what me giving them homework is going to make them feel bad when they don't do it, I'm not going to give it to them.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the keys of really understanding your client and understanding the unique needs of your clients. And rather than just doing a cookie cutter thing, like if you don't do these things, then how do I know that this is actually working for you? But there are all other ways of knowing how this is actually working for a client without having to actually do homework, right? So that's really amazing. I do want to come back to this idea. I think, I don't know if you mentioned while we were talking about offline, you had talked about one of the things that you see in high-performing clients is burnout. Just in terms of generally speaking, can you share an anecdote or something that really helped a client, or that was a really particularly difficult situation, or how did this client address burnout specifically?
Yeah, so burnout is it's this funny kind of phenomena that we know is present. Most of the studies have been done on health professionals, actually, medical, and I've got several folks in that population that have struggled a bit with it. And also, I think it can happen. I'm thinking I've got several women that I see who are either C-suite or they're on lots of boards, and they're also trying to be mom, and they're also trying to help, in various other ways. And that turns into more of a conversation about boundary setting and limit setting, because I find that, we know this, right? If you want something to get done, hand it to a busy person, right? Ask a busy person, because they just know how to do it. They'll just add it in and figure it out. But this chronic need to take on more, and this ability that we have, eventually you're down the road and it's exhausting. And it almost feels like, people describe it like they're sort of just driven by a machine and they can't not do it. And so getting someone like that to start setting boundaries is there's a book I love, Nedra Tawwab, I think is her last name. It's called Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And I love that book. I have given it, as a recommendation over and over again to folks, and initially when some people read that, they're like, that sounds so mean. And I'm like, I know it's not, but you just don't have any boundaries. Boundaries actually are helpful for everybody. They're helpful for you, but they're actually also helpful for the folks you're working with or your people in your personal life, because they let everybody know that there are limits. And I think that's helpful, and it gives some structure and some, good expectations. So, the burnout folks have to downshift, right? They've got to set some limits, and they have to not just set the limit, but enforce the limit. And again, I'm thinking about this study that I just heard about burnout, and they were saying, though, it's not just about self-care. Self-care matters, but it's about how much are you enjoying the work? How meaningful is it? How appreciated do you feel? Right? So it's all of the things. I know a lot of really high performing people they're very attached to performance, like just being highly productive all the time. And so reframing some of this and taking a look at actually what feels meaningful to you, what else feels valuable to you, and can you prioritize that? Can you see the value of not just sleeping is important, of course, but also having a well-rounded life in other ways that matter to you. So trying to get some balance in these areas is always challenging with those folks.
Right. But these are like really some amazing questions to sort of dig deeper in a session. But I'm really curious, you mentioned this at the very beginning. You said there's almost a chronic need to take on more. What's that about?
Yeah. So it all goes back to your family of origin, right? Like it does. I mean, because I think that there is a psychology of performance and reward. And the reward is different for everybody. Some people are really motivated by money. Some people just want power. Some people want to feel appreciated. A lot of caregivers or doers are they like to feel appreciated and important, and sometimes there's almost a hesitation to let go because they're afraid that void will be filled by somebody else, and then suddenly they're irrelevant or something. It's not really logical, and oftentimes, especially on the financial side, if that's their main motivation, it's not logical because they have enough money. They probably have enough money to stop working now, and yet, but there's this motivation that is pulling them because their worth is tied into achievement, and no, their worth is tied to their achievement, and yeah, there's a flip side to that, which is, okay, and then what happens if your job breaks up with you? Because I've seen that happen. Or what about if you retire or you get, eventually asked to step down and retire? Then if all your worth is tied into achievement, then you're suddenly in this position of feeling like, why did I work so hard for 40 years,
Right. And that's so important. But I want to hold this thought for family of origin, because before we get into it, because I do want to dig a little bit deeper into how, as clinicians, we are trained to address that. But as coaches, how do we see that, and how do we not go into a therapy mode as opposed to coaching mode? I do want to circle back and come to that. But before I do that, another quick question for you is, can you give an example of what's the difference between a limit setting versus a boundary setting? Or are they both the same?
I would say they're about the same. I mean, when you're setting boundaries, you are setting limits. Yeah. Limits on space or time or, what am I going to take on? Either like, how long are we going to do this thing, or how involved am I going to be on this project, or what do I expect to get compensated for it, or, a million versions of it. But yeah, I think they're kind of one and the same.
Okay. And what is the most common or rather effective way where you see your clients set boundaries?
I would say that this is a muscle that they need to build. Out of the gates, they don't typically have it. So I have them start doing it in low-level ways. And so if they are people pleasers, then I say, what, don't be the first to raise your hand when they're looking for someone to do X, Y, and Z. Just don't raise your hand. Just stay quiet and let it get awkward, because everybody thinks that they're going to raise their hand, because they always do. But don't do that. It might also be, let's look at the bigger picture of your commitments. What takes up all your time, and whittle down, like what can you get rid of? Can you maybe unsubscribe? Start small, right? Can you unsubscribe to a bunch of things you don't ever read? Or can you, step down maybe from a commitment into a lower role or no role off of a board or something like that? That's sort of like where it begins, is like learning to say, no, don't take on any more. And then also cut some of the fat that you don't actually need, that just adds more stress to your everyday,
Yeah. So I'm almost like sensing that the real first level is understanding or having enough awareness to some of the behaviors that you do that are not helpful for you and have just been very problematic in in dealing with burnout or work-life balance. So creating that level of self-awareness, because when you really talk about saying, don't raise your hand, it's almost saying just because when you raise your hand, you're almost like going to be the person and taking on more. And right, so it
and
almost
they get something out of it. They get something out of the hand raise, right? They get to be the savior. They get to be. They also make everybody else feel relief that they didn't have to raise their hand, but it comes at a cost of impacting your schedule and your well-being. And so, and you could also look at it as you're taking away that opportunity for leadership from somebody else. Sometimes that works.
So, absolutely, right? But also the other thing that you kind of said also was, one is self-awareness, and the second is just kind of helping them prioritize, like what is it among all the 5 things that you're doing, a board position or a parent council chair or your full-time job or taking care of your elderly parent or like whatever it is, like let's prioritize what are the important things that we want, and then just take away the things that really we're just doing it for, I don't know.
Yeah. And sometimes this is a fine tuning, right? This is a recalibration that we do over our lifetime of what matters now and what's reasonable. Like for me, I can't just say, I'm going to cut my workload to this. Like, I've made commitments to people, but I can be aware that I can say no going forward. So it kind of depends on the nuance of their life. That I actually am reading a book now called The Fun Habit. And he talks about mapping out your schedule in this way and really looking at things that bring you dread. I love that. I don't even know if he used those words, but more or less that was kind of the sentiment of just how do you get really honest with yourself about how are you spending your time, and how would you love to imagine spending your time, and then how do we get there? That would be helpful, I think, for a lot of folks.
That seems like a really cool tool to talk about. I don't know if you've read the book fully or if you're like sort of into it, but
I'm like a third of the way through it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll come back and ask you that question. But I think that the couple of things that you're talking about in terms of just boundary or limit setting is like really creating small steps of self-awareness, like helping them prioritize, helping them understand how some of their own behaviors are like, not allowing them to live this like really, beautiful, balanced lives. I mean, they have great lives. Let's not get that wrong, but at least that they can do more and be less stressful or anxious, right? And I think also the big pieces that I heard you say is that we have to build that muscle. It's not just something that comes by just going to therapy for like 10 sessions and expecting it to happen. It just won't happen that way.
Right. And also therapy is not like an MD where they assess you, give you a prescription and send you on your way, right? It's collaborative. It is work that you do together. And so you've got to be ready and willing to implement. And it's for me, it's a lot of times it's an experiment. I've got all kinds of ideas about what's going on, but I'm not going to get the full story in the first few sessions even, because there's so much history, and likely they're hiding things from me and they're hiding things from themselves. And so as we start to put the pieces together, back to family of origin, that is backleading oftentimes how we live our lives. And so building some awareness of that is really helpful to know why we're doing what it is. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a great segue to what I mentioned earlier about talking about the family of origin. And we both know this as just clinicians in general, because a lot of it stems from that. But in the coaching space in the last few years, I mean, I've completely kind of pivoted to leadership and executive coaching. And it's been very fascinating for me to see this balance that I try to see all of like the coaches kind of manage. How does one not address the deeper issues around whether connected to trauma, big trauma, small trauma, or family of origin, and like without like, how do we not address that and just address like the behaviors? Like, how do you do that? Like between coaching versus therapy in your sessions?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. You can't, if you're trained as a therapist, I think you can't not know what you know. And so it's definitely informing. And that's why I love when therapists are coaches versus just coaches are coaches, because I think therapists who become coaches have this breadth of knowledge that is really helpful and so informed. But also you've got to know the limits of the space that you're working in. And so, for example, family of origin stuff, most people, if you hand them, there's basic questionnaires that look at attachment style. And that is something I give because it matters. Your attachment style informs your sexual life too, like your sexual approach. It all does. And that's something that I've brought into the room, because if you are anxiously attached, you're probably, that anxious attachment plays out in the bedroom too. You might be more tending towards pleasing or deferring to your partner, or worrying, hey, are you okay? Did that work for you? Or not speaking up and saying your needs. Whereas on the flip side, if you're avoidant in the bedroom, that's going to show up in that you might accept some pleasure, but you're not going to necessarily want to cuddle after. You're not going to want to have lots of heartfelt conversations, and so understanding the framework of where you're coming from is helpful regardless, because it's almost like, you have at least some frame to work from that you can operate going forward. And once people are aware of it, they can actually change too, because I think they can make more conscious decisions rather than have it feel like it's just automatic. They recognize that there's options to do it a different way, and they can take sometimes contrary action to what their knee-jerk response or go-to might be.
Yeah. I mean, and that's where I am always like so curious, because I know some really amazing coaches that do some really great work, honestly, right? But I wonder always, how are we not addressing some of these issues? I mean, even to your point, like looking at attachment styles gives us so much, gives us, and more than us, gives the client so much knowledge that they can go from in how it's impacting their current behaviors. Right? Why are you not cuddling after? Like, because it just has such a direct, maybe sometimes not so direct correlation. And I'm curious, like, how do people actually not address, let's say, anger or something, and actually address a behavior?
Yeah, it's pretty hard, because it's interesting, right? Like, where does change happen? It can change. There's a cycle of things that are interrelated. So if you ask for someone to take contrary behavior, that's a very 12-step language, take different action, take right action, and the feelings will follow. Oftentimes we more think if you feel a certain way, then the behavior will follow. But either can impact the other. When that's another thing with 12-step is esteemable acts build esteem, right? So if you are living a life of integrity, in whatever we're talking about, like whatever industry, you're likely to feel more esteem. If you feel like you're taking shortcuts, or if some of this stuff, like, so you can recommend behavioral changes without fully understanding the underneath. I think ideally, I would say it's still really valuable to unpack and to do some sorting for yourself. And maybe this would be coach led, of how do I feel when this happens? So if anger is the presenting issue, if they're quick to anger, what is under the anger? Is it that I feel disregarded, or I feel afraid, or I feel, because there's something underneath it, right? So if they at least have some psychoeducation, some awareness of what's causing that presentation that's problematic in the workplace, then they can have maybe a chance to catch it before it becomes, so it's not so automatic. We're making it more explicit.
Yeah. And I think I agree with you that I feel like therapists make really amazing coaches, and I wish more and more therapists kind of got into the coaching industry, because I almost, and I'm wondering if you do this too, sometimes I know what I really don't want to address, but I know enough to not address it, but work with the situation. And I'm always curious when coaches see this, because they're highly intelligent. They see some of these behaviors, but maybe they have a workaround of doing what we do as therapists, right? But ideally, at the end of the day, addressing the behavior and maybe keeping it to the present moment and saying, okay, you're angry at your coworkers or your team members or your peers, and what's that about? And keeping it the context of that workplace maybe just helps them, have different sections for it without going into the family of origin.
Right. Yeah, because if something happens like if it's a one-off, then, that's different. But if it's a pattern of behavior, then I think it's worthwhile to name that, and then also try to understand at least what are the triggers, so very basic CBT stuff, but looking at kind of what are the triggers that bring it on, what else could be true, trying to do some of that basic stuff. And I don't know, maybe that's out of the lane of coaching, but I don't know how you could really do, if those are the issues that are presenting. Yeah, it's hard. But the other piece is back to the relationship, right? If they trust you and if they feel heard and if they're able to even tell you that they get angry in these situations and you don't turn on them, you just hold that and allow for it, they've got most of the answers inside. But the shame and the self-judgment, it oftentimes derails that process. But if you can sit there and be witness to it and get really curious with them as a coach, I think that can be really helpful for them to solve their own problems.
Yeah, I think that, I can definitely kind of see like some of the coaches that I know and how they can hold that space, because they are that kind of people that when people come in and there's such a level of psychological safety in that setting that this person doesn't even need the answers. They just need somebody to be in a non-judgmental space. And like you said earlier, to just vomit everything out. And they have the answers themselves. And once they sort all of that out, they're like, yeah, I don't want to be this kind of person at work. This is not who I am or who I want to show up as. Yeah.
Curiosity is such a helpful way to meet anybody, really.
Yeah. Agreed. 100%. I also want to talk to you about the women that you see, like both in your therapeutic clinical setting and as well as your coaching setting. And one of the things that commonly comes up when I'm working with women is imposter syndrome. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you see, and how do you help women that are sort of dealing with that?
Yes. Imposter syndrome is so interesting to me. It definitely comes up. It comes up with men and women, by the way. It's a universal phenomenon. Because I think that we as humans have not always been successful, right? There's been moments of loss or where you got shut out or some sort of perceived failure. And so as successful people rise, I mean, statistically, it's been shown that they had lots of failures to get to their success. And so they have memory of those failures. And I think they kind of lodge in the back of their head. And also women in particular have additional stressors of just being female in the workplace, even more so if you're of color. Like there's just these extra layers of being held back that can add to the self-doubt about, do I belong here? Have I earned my spot? Do I really know what I know? Do the people around me actually believe in my capability? Yeah.
And I think part of what you're saying is that part of it could be their own internal struggles, their history around work performance, or their ability to like really have full confidence in themselves. And part of it also could be systemic in terms of what's happening culturally within an organization, and how that organization is supporting this individual to develop their own sense of self-confidence. And does a culture support and promote that for every person within that organization? So it's a two-part combination. And what are some of the things what are some of the go-to tools that you help men or women dealing with imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So it's interesting because a bit of it is how true are the fears that you're holding? That's a big one, right? Is let's do a proper assessment. Like, how true are they? Now, if your fear is that you're going to get fired or, you're going to get demoted or something like that, like we start doing some reality testing on that. Like, what if your reviews looked like? What do your coworkers, borrow a coworker, what would they say about you if they had to do a peer review type of thing? What do we know about actually what has presented in your work world? And what do we know about your skill set and how it matches the job that you're actually performing? So some of it's a little bit of like, how possible is it? Also, have you seen that thing play out with other people? If this is a company that's cutthroat, that fires left and right, then your head might be on the chopping block. Because if that's the culture and it can happen like this and you're disposable, yes, it could happen. But I find that really successful people that are at no risk of losing their job feel like an imposter a lot. Like, it definitely is common. So, I think initially it's like properly assessing the situation. Next would be look at past successes. And, that can be, I have a client that I can think of that she's so smart, and she's a writer, and, she was going for this job, and she just felt so much nervousness about it. And she went and pulled an award that she had gotten from something, and she literally posted it across the room where she could see it, because she was doing a video thing, but she posted it right above the screen so she could remember, I've already been awarded this amazing thing because I am good at my job. And that was helpful to her as a reminder of validation, external validation. Ideally, we're doing internal, but it was something to remind her and to counterbalance that negative talk about, you're fake. You're not really, gonna deserve this. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is initially actually do like a self-assessment, reality-based testing to see like, is this true what you're really believing about yourself? And part of it I definitely feel like has a connection to rational and irrational behaviors that we do in CBT work. Like, let's really see, is this an irrational fear or thought, or is there anything based in reality about this? And then the other thing that you're seeing is once you've addressed it and you've said, okay, there could be some truth to that. Maybe it's not the culture. Maybe there's some feeling around, how you're thinking about this. Then you're saying one of the tools that it helped one of your clients is to have like a visualization of their past successes that really helped her in that moment. Because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about, whether we're clinicians or coaches, is that understanding is one thing, processing it is another thing, but implementing it when you actually need it in real life is the key.
Yeah. Yeah. In that moment, when the flood of fear, which, by the way, anticipatory anxiety, adrenaline is normal. When you're in a high pressure situation, say you're going to give a big presentation or a speech, or you're going to ask for something big, you're a salesperson and you're closing the deal. It's normal to feel a flood of anxiety, but you've got to normalize it enough to know that you're going to metabolize that. You're going to show up. You do have the chops, and you just got to see it through. Yeah. Another piece too that I think is helpful, just to kind of close the loop on that, I think too, is with the imposter syndrome, is I think oftentimes people psych themselves out about how they're being perceived. And so they're so internally looking that they're not recognizing what's happening in real time. And if they can humanize the people that they're interacting with, that can also be a way to be leveling, rather than having you suddenly feel like you're way down here. It levels it if you can, sort of see them just as a person that put on their clothes just like you did in the morning, and is, sipping their coffee, and they've got a life, and they've got fears, and they've got stressors, and they've got family and health issues and all the same stuff you do, right? So humanize the person you're with so that you don't make them so much like out of your league, and that can be helpful too.
It's almost like saying to, and we've heard this say, a lot of people say it, like when you're going on stage, just imagine everybody's like not wearing clothes or something like that.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? Wait.
I mean, it's so silly, right? You're just like, what? Oh my God. But yeah, somehow that's just like, oh yeah, you saw all those people naked. They don't seem as intimidating.
Yeah. And I really like the humanizing aspect of it, because I think what you're really talking about is when we are flooded with anxiety in that moment and all our emotions appear so close to us, and we want to just push them far away visually so we can actually think clearly, right? And in that moment, if we can just have a tool, enough awareness to say, oh my God, I'm totally getting flooded. I'm just going to bomb this because I have anxiety. And then one of the tools is, if I can just be like, okay, just take 5 deep breaths, and let's just kind of, that person is like a normal person like me, and and they're going to get their coffee, they wear their clothes, they go take a shower, they go to the pool, like, whatever it is. And it almost feels like it's like a 10, 15 or 20-second exercise that we internally do to regulate our emotions.
Yeah. And I tell you, like, as a therapist, the people that come in, like, it's vignettes. If I just snapped through like my week, everybody that's walking in is pretty high functioning, high performing, but they come in here and they sit down and they have personal lives that are a little bit, complicated or in disarray. And so you don't know what's going on for somebody, but if you could humanize them, like, I don't know, I think it can be helpful to just say they're just going through some stuff, and they're just sitting there, and
yeah. I know about this because in my work we do this, but as you're saying it, I almost like had an epiphany, because I go myself to like really these high intense, high level executive and leadership coaching, workshops or seminars where I am part of this group or team that is doing the work. And I always have such a sense of I don't belong here for a quick second, because I come from such a therapy world that it's different to right away shift. And as you're saying that, and I'm thinking, man, I could totally just use this as I'm just sitting there and looking at everybody before the workshop begins. And keep having that sort of mantra in my head as my anxiety builds up. And then
back
just
to the curiosity.
work through that.
If you have curiosity in who else is in the room, and you stop thinking about am I sitting weird? Am I sounding weird? Do I look right? Do I belong here? Am I old, too young? Blah, blah, blah. Instead, you're just what's that person doing? What's that person? What are they about? It helps sort of change the focus, and the curiosity calms the mind. Yeah, get you back into your prefrontal cortex. That's what's happening.
Right. And get you into your zone of doing what you do best in that moment, right? And I think the other thing that kind of what you said about, we see in our sessions clients, high-performing clients who are really amazing at their job on the outside. When they come to our sessions, we see, their fears, we see their apprehension, we see their anxiety. And I almost want to remind myself of that when I find myself in that situation, to be like, wait a minute, we're all going through the same thing at some level or the other. It's how we manage and address it in the moment is going to make or break the deal. Love it, Jenn. One other thing that I think I see, and I don't know if you see this too, is this level of emotional dysregulation that happens at very basic level to high level. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, therapeutically, we like to talk about the window of tolerance. And when people are out of that window, that's where they can think and they can act from their executive part of their brain. But when they're overwhelmed, they tend to go into hypo or hyper arousal. And so the hypo can look like anger. It can look like outbursts. It can, people get big and like they're trying to fight. They're going into fight mode. And the hypo is when they're sort of collapsing, right? And they're more collapsing emotionally, where they get quiet, they recede. And we see this in the workplace all the time, right? There's people that get big when they get upset, and there's people that get very small. And so the ability to regulate yourself, understand when that one of those two things is, because you probably know what you go to, right? Most of us go to one or the other. And when that's coming on, what's happening for you in your body, and how can you meet that? Probably some breathing, again, some reality testing, but staying regulated is critical, because if you are in one of those other zones, you're not really thinking, and you're not therefore interacting in a way that is going to be useful or helpful or even authentic down the, in your work relationship.
And have you ever had the situation where high performing individual comes and they say, I don't know why everybody's saying I have an anger issue. I really don't. And there's all these people around me that irritate me, bug me, or I'm just getting I'm reacting to what's happening around me, and I'm not an angry person. What do you say to somebody? What are some of the questions we want to ask or approach to this person to create a level of curiosity among how they are showing up?
Yeah. So I find that when folks are in that space, back to family of origin, they probably have had it modeled for them along the way. That was normalized. I also strangely kind of see that sometimes when I see East Coasters communicating with West Coasters, the communication styles are different. And so sometimes the East Coasters can be perceived as a little sharp or rude, and they're not. It's not abrasive. It's a style. So sometimes it's style. Sometimes though, if it's a pattern of behavior, especially with anger or irritability, which can feel angry, to somebody who's maybe a little more passive or meek. I guess I would get curious about that person. How busy are they? What's their level of overwhelm? Because oftentimes as we get busier and busier, we tend to we don't have as much patience. We don't have as much curiosity. We don't have as much capacity for downshifting or shifting for different styles that exist within the workplace. So, we kind of go to the most efficient way to function, and we don't have a lot of space for that. So I guess I would say, what is their level of overwhelm? I want to understand that. And what is their level of awareness of what the irritant is about? Because that's kind of a mismatch, right? If they're getting feedback that they're angry, but they don't feel angry. So I would want to know, do they feel angry with me? Like, what am I sensing in the room? It's a bit hard to coach somebody if you don't see the behavior manifest. And so I would want to have them either retell it or react it out, or act like the person who they're interacting with. Like help them understand sort of what is the dynamic. Because if it's a one-off, it might just be personality things. But if it's a system-wide, then I get a little more curious about kind of what their blind spots are with their own current cognitive, state.
And to add to that, let's just say you go through this process with them of really understanding how busy are they overwhelmed, and they start speaking about their day, and then you kind of have like an awareness where, oh my God, like you literally have zero time to do anything. So what's the next step for somebody like that? Let's just say we've understood that they're just overwhelmed. So what's the next step?
Yeah, well, I mean, we sort of touched on this before, the circling back of like some boundary setting. Also, how can they, because I find that when people are in that space, they are not having their needs met, and they're turning off the signals of their own body of their needs. And so they might not be eating lunch. Their blood sugar might not be stable. They probably aren't getting enough sleep because they're waking up with anxiety, or they're struggling to go to sleep with insomnia because the stress level has hit a fever pitch that, so part of it's like, how's your overall wellness look? And can you carve out little bits of time for yourself? And maybe that's a 15-minute walk in the middle of the day, or, maybe that's a once a month call with your best friend. It's like, what can you manage to start to have some outlets to off put some of this like negative energy, and start, because their needs probably aren't feeling very met. If you're that edgy, then typically there's a level of overwhelm that, you're just functioning. You're not really living. So attending
to that definitely will help them sort of not only have their needs met, but give themselves some time that allows them to just sort of regulate and be more like grounded in their day-to-day interactions. But I'm kind of curious, all these things that you mentioned are like, sleep and eat, rest, physiological needs. Is there a level of emotional needs that are not met? And if there is, what are these emotional needs that could not necessarily be met? Either in a relationship or lack of relationship or things like that.
Yeah, I would say there's relationship to self and there's relationship to like a primary other, that both can sometimes really get neglected. And so the self-care piece, the knowing what brings you joy and engaging in that with some regularity, is the relationship to self, and knowing limits and that type of thing. Relationship to other, though, is a big blind spot oftentimes, because that relationship is so habitual and it's kind of ever present. And so the shift that is required to go home and then plug into another person, and to leave the work life at work, and to come in and be open and available in a different way than maybe you can at the office, is kind of a difficult transition for a lot of folks. And so, again, having time set aside. I have clients that I'll say, hey, can you guys schedule in a date night, and a date night once a week or every 2 weeks or something, where you've got time where you don't just discuss logistics. You don't discuss, like the running of the business of the house. You actually just be curious towards each other. You connect. I think that is hugely important, because otherwise it starts to feel like you're roommates and you're just trying to like keep this machine going, instead of like partners.
And it almost, I think a lot of people, especially when I used to previously do couples work, would always imagine there's just like some grand gesture, there's some dramatic thing that they need to change. And we're really talking about simple things like a date night, where there's good boundaries around saying, we're not going to talk about the kids dropping off or the tuition or this or that or the groceries, but we'll just talk about each other.
Right. And that's that time of having regular contact with another is so important, because having that it gives you more dimension to self. It has you connected to another who is showing interest in your life and tracking with you. That is hugely meaningful. And I think it helps with kind of well-rounding our life altogether.
Yeah. And I think this also circles back to your initial, client that you kind of spoke about, that part of his work was really about connecting and making friendships that he never did because so much of his life surrounded around just getting work done. And it kind of speaks to the same thing. Like if we can create meaningful relationships outside of all these like functions that we have to do, the social integration piece of it is like really key for overall wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Incredible. Small things. All right, Jenn. What is, as we're sort of like winding down, I do want to ask you something. Is there something that you want to share with my audience that I haven't asked? I actually haven't done this with any of my other guests, and I'm sort of leaning into what I'm feeling. I feel like we've spoken about so many different things. Is there something about your work or how your clients, effectiveness of working with your clients that comes up that you sort of haven't shared with or would like to speak about?
Yeah, let me think about that for a second. I guess I would say, I'm so focused on the coupleship and people's sex life. And I don't think that you can compartmentalize those quite successfully ever. I think that what's happening in your sex life is typically a microcosm of what's happening in your bigger life. And if you've got an imbalanced work life, if you feel a lot of stress or a lot of insecurity or a lot of frustration, like it's hard to just leave that disconnect and not have it show up. I find that it often is there. And just like what we talked about with thoughts and feelings, I think that one can help the other. So I think having a vibrant sex life, and sex life doesn't mean you're having sex. It can also mean sensuality. It can also mean touching, closeness, intimacy of all sorts. I think that is so enriching. It fills up your emotional bank account, and it really does. At the end of your life, your work will matter, but your relationships will matter more. And so, I encourage people to have both, and to have a fulfilling sex life. I think is totally possible. We shouldn't write it off.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think that also speaks to your initial point at the very beginning when you talk about work-life balance and you see all of these like high-powered individuals come with their partners, and there's just such a incongruence in how they're behaving professionally as opposed to what's happening personally. And just by addressing those, we are like addressing the bigger picture of how that's impacting. Just because you're doing really well in one area, that doesn't mean that you're doing well in general. And I think that's a great point you bring to the conversation. Let me ask you this: what is like your sort of recipe for life zone, or like what is like your recipe for a work-life balance? And how as you're looking at 2024, what are some of the things that you're looking at?
Yeah, so for 2024, I am hoping to I'm stratifying my business. So I've been doing this small group for women. I'm going to introduce a workbook for folks that want to be self-led. I'm going to introduce a recorded option for folks who also want to be self-led, but with more interaction from me. And then I'm introducing a retreat. So there's 4 levels. So that's super ambitious, but that's sort of where I'm going. In terms of like a nugget, I guess, that I would leave people with, again, I'm a sex therapist, so I'm always sort of thinking through that lens. And that is that you must know how to please yourself before anyone else can really please you. And that can be, I would say adapted to any environment, but you have to understand, what do you need out of this meeting, or what do you need out of this encounter, or what works for you? Because I feel like a lot of times couples have this mismatch because we're not robots. We're not all the same. You know your body. You know your mind. You know what turns you on and turns you off. And I feel like it's important for us to be able to know ourselves first, and then we can help guide and ask for more from others in a strategic way. So, yeah.
So know ourselves first before we even want to kind of point a finger at others or be like, hey, this is not working. But understanding more of ourselves will help us understand relationships around us and help us engage better is what we want to leave our audience with. I love that. Thank you, Jenn. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And I really, really appreciate your time. And I can't wait to post about this.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Hey, this is Deepa again. I hope you really enjoyed my show today. Thank you so much for listening to our conversation. If you'd love to get in touch with me or my guest, or would like the show notes, resources, or links, please reach out to me on my website. I would also love your feedback. Until next time.